Hey folks, welcome to week 10 of DMD 105, Digital Design Foundations. All right, this week we are introducing a whole new design concept. We are introducing the idea of typography in week 10. So now typography, of course, is a concept that goes well beyond Adobe Illustrator, but we are using Adobe Illustrator as the software by which we are going to explore typography, because as a vector graphics tool, typography lives really well inside of Adobe Illustrator, and I'll explain why in a little bit. So two parts of it this week. The first part in today's lecture is we're going to go over some of the typography tools that are available in Adobe Illustrator, and then you're going to have time between now and the next time we meet to play around with those typography tools and practice with them in Illustrator. Then when I see you next, we're going to go over all of the items that are here in the week 10 overview. We're going to watch this introductory video about typography, and we're going to take a look at these various handouts here about depth perception and readability, historical classifications, history of common typefaces, letter form anatomy, text formatting, and typesetting guidelines. We'll take a quick look at some of them here. This is sort of history of common typefaces, this is letter form anatomy, and this is text formatting. There is going to be a quiz later on about some of this, specifically the anatomy of letter forms. So you might want to download these handouts early and start reading through them on your own. Like I said, we are going to go through them together. So there's really, there'll be an opportunity for us to go over them and for you to ask questions and for us to really have a good conversation about the basics of typography. Now, of course, typography as an area of study in design is something that is fairly robust and actually eats up entire classes. If you were getting a BFA degree at a design school, for example, you would take at least one full typography class, probably two, maybe even three of them. So eating up anywhere from 16 to 90 some odd weeks worth of typography. So there's a lot to learn. We, over the next couple of weeks, this week and next week, are going to really explore some of the basics and talk about how you can use typography effectively in your design work, and specifically through Adobe Illustrator. But consider this just sort of an introduction and a primer to typography. Of course, in the world of visual design, typography is about 50% of most designs. It's normally the marriage between image and typography creates a communicative visual design. And so it's a really important part of design. So we're going to spend a good amount of time on it, but certainly make the time to read through these handouts, maybe watch the video, and we, of course, will get into it together next time we meet. Now, in the meantime, we're going to hop on over to Adobe Illustrator, and we're going to take a look at these, the Type tool, the Type on a Path tool, typographic boxes, typographic adjustments, working with paragraphs, and laying out copy. So let's go do that right now. All right, so we're going to hop over into Illustrator here. And so we have a nice blank document in Adobe Illustrator. And so the Type tool is easy to access. It exists over here in the toolbox, and it's easy to find because it's the giant letter T over on the left-hand side, right below the Pen tool. So if you click on that, it'll engage the Type tool, and a couple of things will happen. First of all, your cursor will change from a black selection arrow to this typographic arrow right here, which is a little black arrow with a blinking typography cursor, which you're probably familiar with because we see it in Microsoft Word or Google Docs or other sorts of desktop publishing software. Also up here in the tool-specific menu, if you have that engaged, you're going to see that aside from some basic tools like fill and stroke weight over here, we have our typographic tools like your choice of fonts. This is drawn from your Adobe collection and whatever fonts you have loaded onto your computer. So your list might look different than my list, but whatever fonts you have loaded, you're going to find here. And what's nice about the list in Illustrator is that you can filter the list by using some of these filtering systems by classification. We'll learn more about classifications a little later in the week, but of course there are different types of fonts. So you can filter by different categories, which comes in handy. You can favorite some of your fonts. I have probably like 300 fonts on my computer, so it helps to have some favorites. And you can also view them in different sizes. So this is medium, but I can enlarge the size so I can see them larger, which is helpful because in the list, not only do I have an alphabetical listing of them, but over here in the second column, I have a sample using the word sample of what the typeface looks like. So it gives me a pretty easy idea of what they look like. And note that some typefaces, if they have a arrow to the left of them, have adjoining type styles. So for example, Georgia comes with both regular, italic, bold, and bold italic. But then others like Geneva here, which don't have a little arrow next to them, just come in one flavor, okay? And we'll talk about sort of why type styles are important later on. Now the other thing about the typography pull-down menu is that you can access the Adobe Font Collection, which you can see is initializing here, which will get us into the online Adobe Font Collection. If you are signed into your Adobe account, you can access those through any of the Adobe software as well as the ones that you have loaded locally. Then, of course, next to your font selection are those aforementioned type styles. So once you pick an initial font family, if there are any associated type styles, they will show up here in the Type Styles pull-down menu. So you can see that Myriad Pro comes with a variety of type styles, right? Then, of course, you have your font size, which you can adjust a number of different ways. You can simply click up and down through the point sizes. Remember that type is measured in points, not in pixels, not in inches, not in millimeters, but by points. You have presets. If you hit the old pull-down menu here, you can have preset sizes. Or, of course, you can just click into the text bar and type in whatever size you want and simply hit Tab on your keyboard, and it engages. So these here are what we call character settings. Now, a character simply refers to the actual letter of the alphabet. Now, in addition to these character tools, the font choice, the type style, and the font size, to the left here is the word character, and if you click on that, it opens up an entire character menu, which gives you many more adjustments on top of those three obvious ones. It does repeat some of them, like you can also access the font menu this way, and the type styles and the font size, but it gives you access to some other common measurements, which we're going to learn about later on, but I'm just going to introduce you to them here. So this one is leading, right, which is the vertical space between baselines. This here is about kerning between individual characters, individual letters. This is tracking or letter spacing. This here is both a vertical and a horizontal scale, which allows you to stretch the letters, but I'll give you a preview right now. Don't ever stretch your letters. It's a terrible idea. This here is baseline shift, which moves the baseline up and down, and this here allows you to rotate individual characters. These are down here called forced styles, meaning these are not type styles that come with the individual font, but these are type styles that are forced onto the type by the software. There is all caps, small caps, superscript, subscript, underline, and strike through, some of which you'll be familiar with. You can also change the basic language of the typography shown, of the alphabets, from English to any of these other common alphabets around the world. And of course, there are some other adjustments down the bottom here with regard to how the type presents itself visually. We'll learn more about what these measurements are later on, but that's how you access the character palette. Now, moving on to the right, we have paragraph adjustments. Now, the only three that are available here are alignment. These you should be familiar with from, say, Microsoft Word or Google Docs. We have left alignment, center alignment, and right alignment. But similar to character, if we click on the paragraph link here, you can access more adjustments, including other alignments beyond the initial three. We have justify last line center, justify last line right, and then justify all lines, also known as forced justification. We have left indent, right indent, first line indent, as well as a few other adjustments at the bottom here, and you can choose to have or not have hyphenation in your paragraphs by simply checking or unchecking this box. So pretty much all of your major typographic adjustments are right up here in your tool-specific menu. And as you can imagine, you can also access those exact same adjustments here in the Properties palette, starting right here. You have your typical properties here, including fill, stroke, and opacity, as well as layer effects, but here are all the typography tools right towards the middle bottom of the Properties palette, all the character adjustments and all of the paragraph adjustments. And if you want to access those free-floating menus I just showed you, you can click on the three dots, and the remainder of that menu will pop up as such. So two places, as usual, to access all the adjustments. Now, in the world of typography, that's pretty much all you need for adjustments, is the character adjustments and the paragraph adjustments. Even though there's a lot of them, bunched together. And then, of course, the color of your type, as well as if you put any stroke around your type, is also available, just like for any other shape. So that's all good to know. Now, underneath the toolbox, if you look at the type tool, you'll see there is the little triangle in the lower right, which tells us that if we hold down on it, there are other type tools living underneath here. There is the standard type tool, just the regular one, the area type tool, type on a path, and then there's some repeat items, but in different directions. There's the vertical type tool, the vertical area tool, and the vertical tool on a path. And there's also a new tool, relatively new, called the touch type tool. And we're going to explore all of those. But let's look at the basics. So first things first, before you start adding some type, it is helpful to sort of establish what your font is and the font size. Now, of course, you're not married to this idea. You can change it anytime you want. But the main thing I like to do in advance is make sure that my font size is pretty big so that I can see it. So I'm just going to crank up the font size here to something pretty jumbo so that when I start typing, I can see it. Okay. The other thing you want to look at first is your color. So you can do that down in the color picker, or you can do it up here in the tool specific menu, or you can do it over here in the properties palette, wherever you want. But type, of course, right out of the gate should not have an outline around it. It should just be a flat fill color. You can always add an outline later if it's appropriate for your font choice, but generally speaking, type shouldn't have an outline, at least initially. So I'm going to go to the stroke palette and just choose that universal symbol for none so that there's no stroke. Now, of course, white is not going to help me out for a fill color because I'm working on white paper, so I won't be able to see anything. So just for the sake of ease, I'm going to turn it over to black so that I can see the type nice and simple. Now, there's two ways to interact with the type tool. Number one, you can just click once and get a blinking cursor, and you'll see there that I clicked once somewhere on my document, and it's just blinking like it would in Microsoft Word or Google Docs. And here I can start typing. And this just allows you to start typing a line of type. Now, once I've finished typing what I want to type, you'll notice I still have the blinking cursor at the end, which allows me to keep typing if I want. But if I want to finish what I've typed, and I want to turn this into a bounding box full of type, basically saying I'm done, just like everything else in Illustrator, you want to go back to your black selection arrow, click that, and it engages the bounding box. Now let's take a look at how the bounding box for typography is a little bit different than it is for our other objects we've dealt with in Illustrator so far. So you do have the blue bounding box with the wireframe. You do have the anchor points on the corners and the sides. And of course, if you grab the anchor point and drag it while holding down the shift key, make sure you hold the shift key because you don't want to squish your type. You can enlarge it or shrink it down, which changes the size of your type in a more free-form kind of fashion. But it also has here the, you can hang out over the upper right corner or the lower left corner or whatever, and you can click and rotate your type on an axis, which allows you to do that. So if you want to put it up at an angle, you can do that. Also notice that the bounding box includes an additional blue wire line that appears to run directly under the actual characters themselves that looks like an invisible shelf that the letters are sitting on top of. That's referred to as a baseline. The baseline becomes very important for not only measurements but understanding how typographic anatomy works. So you will hear the term baseline again. So that allows you to pretty much put in just a line of type. Now, to go back to editing it, if I wanted to keep typing or change a word, all I got to do is go back to my type tool, and then you'll see here that outside of the word, I have that dotted line box around the outside of my type tool. When I hover over my existing type, that goes away, and I just get my editable type tool. So then if I click again, I get the blinking cursor, and we can change it to whatever we would like, right? How are you now? You can change the name of it or the word or whatever you'd like. Now, one thing about typing this way is that if I keep typing, right, you'll see that it just keeps running off to the right. It runs right off the screen and keeps going and going and going. At no point will it return back to the next line. So unlike, say, Microsoft Word or Google Docs, what I'm typing is not restrained by the paper size. It just keeps going. Because, of course, in the world of Illustrator, you have lots of empty scratch space that just goes right off the page and keeps going. And so if you wanted to return to the next line as you were typing, you would have to hit the return key on your keyboard and then move it down to the next line. So it's a very manual sort of process, okay? So that's one way that you can add type to an Illustrator document. Now the other way, of course, is to grab your type tool, and instead of just clicking once and typing, you can click and drag out an area. And what you're doing is you're dragging out a text box. Now this is sort of a constrained frame where your type will live, and if I start typing in here, right, I can type something here. And you can see that as I keep typing, it will just automatically jump down to the next line. So by creating a barrier, by creating a space, this type box allows the type to fit into a given space. Now when you're done typing, if you again go back to your black selection arrow and engage the bounding box, you have those same controls, but they act differently. Now if I were to resize the bounding box from one of the anchor points, instead of resizing the type, it just resizes the box that it lives in. The size of the font stays exactly the same. So now if I resize that type box and let go, it just fits the same type into a different sized space. And if I were to rotate that bounding box, it doesn't rotate the type, it rotates the space that it lives in. So same bounding box, different way of acting, right? It acts completely different. So I can make more space or less space. And then also, if I make the space too small to accommodate the amount of type I have, so I'm going to make the type box really small, you'll see I now can't see everything that I typed, but instead in the lower right corner, I get this red square. And that's alerting me to the fact that my type box is too small and I have more type inside here that I can't see. So I would have to resize it to make sure that it fits properly. Okay, now once you've typed something out, whether you've just typed lines of type using the first type tool function or a type box full of type using the second type function, either way, they work pretty much the same from this point on in terms of how you're going to style your type. So if I click on my first entry here, I can go up to my character palette and change the font, right? So instead of making it Myriad Pro, maybe I want to change it to something else. And notice that as I hover over different font choices, that it previews what they look like behind where I am dragging through in my original piece of type, so I can sort of get a nice preview of it, and which is really useful. This is a relatively new function in Illustrator. So this way, once I'm happy with the font, I just simply click on it and it engages it in place here. Now, of course, now that I've chosen a different font and it changes the way it looks within what I wrote, then I can go over here to type style, and I can see that this new font, Cantiga, has different type styles, which again, if I hover over them, will give me a preview as I go along. So I'm going to go from regular to semi-bold. And I can change the font size over here by actually changing the point size. Now remember, I can change the font size in this first option by simply resizing it, but it's much more accurate in the world of typography to simply choose an actual size. So I'm going to make that 48 points right there. Now, I can do the same thing here with the type box. Works exactly the same way. I can choose a different font, right? I was in Myriad. Well, maybe we're going to switch it over to something else here. Let's pick something else completely different. We'll go with Courier. That's always fun. So we'll go with Courier. Kind of looks like typewriter type. And I can go over and choose a type style, make it bold. Now remember when I was showing you the paragraph palette that up here you can turn hyphenation on or off. So you'll see here that it's checked off, so it allows for hyphens, right? It allows for hyphenating longer words by syllables. And so if you look here in the little Mary Had a Little Lamb thing, the word everywhere is hyphenated. Now that's not always ideal. Sometimes when we're laying out paragraphs of type, we don't want to deal with hyphens. And if you want that to be the case, you simply choose your text box, go up here to the paragraph palette, and uncheck hyphenate, and notice that it gets rid of the hyphen and will simply reset the type in a way that does not use hyphens. Pretty great, right? Now I have to resize the box to accommodate everything. Okay, so that works exactly the same in terms of changing your font, your type style, and your font size. Now, similarly, you can change the basic paragraph alignments. Again, I'm going to choose my first one. Notice we are using the black selection arrow quite a bit here to bop back and forth between each selection of type. Now over here I can change it from left justified to center justified. In this case, it moves the entire type box and center justifies the words within it. Same thing with right justification, moves the entire type box and justifies it differently. Meanwhile, over here in the paragraph version, it will keep the text box exactly where it is, but I can go from left to centered to right justification within the box. Pretty straightforward. Now, all of the adjustments work exactly the same way from within these different palettes, either the character palette or the paragraph palette. So in a minute, we're going to take a look at all these specific functions and sort of see what we can do to change things around. The other thing I do want to show you, though, is right now we've been making changes to the entire selection of type, so this whole statement or this whole paragraph. But you can also grab your type tool and highlight just certain words inside of it. Like I'm just going to highlight these two words and leave the rest alone. And then I can change something about just those. So I'll leave the same font, but I'm going to change the type style to just regular bold, or change it to semi-bold italic. And so now just those particular words that I had highlighted, those are affected, but the rest of the words stay the same. So you can get very specific with how you style your type within whatever it is you wrote out, okay? So that's one way to go about it. Now, the other thing we can do is we can make more fine-tuning adjustments by looking at the character palette or the paragraph palette. So we're going to stick with this phrase here for the character palette. I'm going to go back and left justify it again just so it's easier to understand. We'll move that down a little bit, put that there. So now if we open up the character palette, you'll see that we have a bunch of options. So we've already dealt with type choice, font choice, and font style. So that's all cool. We got that. Notice that the font style, the type style, is not showing here because within this phrase I have two different type styles. And so Illustrator does not show you both, so instead it shows you none. That doesn't seem like the greatest solution, but that's sort of how it works. Then again, I can change my font size from here, but really let's look at some other options. So let's talk about leading. So leading is the vertical space between the baselines. So I told you that this blue wire that looks like a shelf that your type is sitting on top of represents a baseline. Now, when you first start typing something out, it's going to have an automatic look to it. Whoever designed the font, and we'll talk about the history of typefaces later, but somebody designed these fonts. A designer who designs fonts for a living is known as a fontographer. And so somebody who designed the fonts made all these choices, not only how each individual letter and character looks, but also how they interact with each other in both the vertical space and the horizontal space. And so the vertical space is measured by leading. Now there's a history to why it's called leading. We'll discuss that later on in the week. But what it is it's that vertical spacing between the two lines of type, or many lines of type. So if I change the leading, so I'm going to grab this box, go to character, go to leading. So you'll see here that in parentheses is a measurement, 57.6 points. Remember, everything in type is measured in points. If it's in parentheses, it means that it's the standard leading for those characters. So Contiga at 48 points, the standard leading is 57.6. Now if I change it from 48 points to say 40 points of type, so now I'm making my font smaller, notice that the leading also changes. So now it's 48 points. So the font choice, the size of the font, is directly related to what the standard leading size is to make it look good. Now this is how the fontographer who designed this typeface wanted it to look, but you, as the designer, have the ability to change it further. So if I want to make it larger than 48, watch what happens to the lines of type. See, they get further apart from each other. So I'm adding more leading. This is referred to as positive leading, right? And then, of course, if I make it smaller, I can have them get closer together, and this is known as negative leading. Now, of course, if I get too close, the letters are going to start to overlap each other, and, well, that hurts readability. Now it makes it difficult to read what that says. But, of course, you can do it. Now, if at any point you want to get back to what the standard leading was, simply go to the pull-down menu, And aside from these presets, you can just simply hit auto, and that will put it back to whatever the standard leading is for that font at that size. Make sense? Now, why would you want to adjust the leading? Well, it has a lot to do with how things are read, and we'll talk more about that later in the week. All right, other things we can adjust. We're going to skip over kerning because we'll deal with that later. But the next thing to look at is tracking, sometimes referred to as letter spacing. Now again, whoever designed this font designed it to look a certain way when you type out words, however you do. And so standard tracking or standard letter spacing is represented here as a 0. So that basically means that that's how it was designed to be. But again, as a designer, you can increase the size of the tracking or the letter spacing, and then that spaces out the letters further apart from each other on a horizontal baseline. Now that's referred to as positive tracking or positive letter spacing. And of course, if we go back in the other direction and make it smaller and smaller, we make them closer together, and that's called negative tracking or negative letter spacing. But just like with the leading, if we make them too close together, they start to overlap, and that hurts readability, right? So it's an adjustment, and you sort of want to do it in a way that helps your viewer read the things the way you want them to read it. If at any point in time you want to go back to the way it was originally designed, go to the pull-down menu, and aside from the various presets, you can simply click on 0 at any point in time, and that puts you back to the way it was originally designed. Now, if you're unsure how to really work with leading and tracking, it's never a bad idea to just leave both of them at their standard measurements, however they were designed by the type designer. So you can just leave it alone, and 9 times out of 10, it will look just fine. But whatever, those adjustments are there for your ability to make them look different. Okay, now these next two adjustments, the vertical and the horizontal sort of stretching of type, even though Illustrator makes these available, I am going to tell you to avoid them, because stretching letter forms is never a great idea, and I'll show you what I mean. Notice that they're both set at 100%. If I go ahead and make it like, say, 200%, I am stretching my type upwards, right? And if I go ahead and go in the other direction and make it like 25%, I am squishing my type downwards. And even though that can be fun and add some interesting effects, it really hurts readability and kind of, in a way, disrespects the way the letter forms were designed. So from a design point of view, it's not a great idea. Now, does this mean you should never do it? No, of course not. There's always situations where maybe it works for the thing you're trying to accomplish. But more than likely, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Now, the other thing we have here is baseline shift. Now, shifting the baseline for an entire phrase isn't super useful. But if we were to go in here and highlight just a couple of words, like we'll go back to our first 2 initial words here, and if there we were to go in and shift the baseline just for those words, what you're doing is you're taking that invisible imaginary shelf and you're moving it either upwards, like that. We'll see what that looks like, right? So you're taking those 2 words and just lifting it up above the other words, or you are going in the opposite direction and moving them downwards, taking that baseline shelf and moving it below where it was originally settled. Now, you can do this for effect. You can do this to get across a certain type of look. It's just another type of adjustment tool that you have in your toolbox as a designer to play with type. And again, if you ever want to get it back to where it belongs originally, just go back to 0 and it resets it. So that's baseline shift. Now, this here is character rotation, and remember, this is different than text box rotation. You can rotate the entire text box using the bounding box by just hovering on the outside and rotating. That rotates the whole text box. But what if you want to rotate just a specific character, right? So let's take the question mark at the end here. What if we wanted to say increase the size of this question mark, right? We'll make it much bigger than the rest of the type, right? We'll make that 60 points. And if we went into our character palette here and we added some rotation just to that character, right, we could spin it on its axis. So maybe the question mark has a little bit of an angle to it. And so now when we look at it, you can see that it adds a little bit of oomph, a little emphasis to that question mark. So again, it's just an adjustment tool that you can use in the various type tools. And again, there are at the bottom here, these are forced styles, which you should be familiar with because they're also available in programs like Microsoft Word and Google Docs and whatnot. Now, these type styles were not designed by the fontographer who designed this typeface. These are available for all fonts, okay, regardless of what they have for type styles. So you can make something all caps, which forces the letters into all uppercase or all capital letters. You can do what's called drop cap, which is they're all uppercase letters, but the first letter of each word is larger than the rest. You can do superscript, which makes them tiny and large. I mean, tiny and raised up, right? That would be for like a footnote or something. And of course, subscript does the opposite. You can underline your type, or you could do a slash through. Now, these have specific purposes. I will say as a designer that all caps and small caps comes in handy a lot. And if you are using your type in a way to footnote something, then superscript or subscript comes in handy. But that's kind of about it. Underline is useful occasionally. I've yet to really use strike through for any good reason, although it does come in handy, I guess. Okay, so that takes care of those character options right here in the type tool. Let's take a look at the paragraph options. All right, now when we're dealing with paragraphs in type, even though down here we have a paragraph of type and not just a couple of lines of type, you can still use all of the adjustments in the character palette. They will affect the type inside a paragraph the same way they would in lines of type. But the other nice thing we have here when we're dealing with paragraphs is not only can we adjust the text box to create a different space for the paragraph to live in, like we just demonstrated, but now you can go over here to the paragraph palette and you have some other adjustments that are a little more specific to paragraphs, right? So again, we have left justified, center justified, right justified. Those are pretty standard. You're familiar with those. Then these three over here, I should say these four, these are called force justifications. And what they do is they push all the type out to the barriers on either side, right and left, of the text box. This is the sort of thing that is generally not good typography because it creates these giant gaps between each word, which are referred to as rivers when you have these sort of big pieces of white space that run through your type. They're called rivers and are not really ideal, and so you got them there, you got them there, you got them there. They're really not great looking. But they do come in handy in some instances, and specifically in certain industries, they're used all the time. When laying out paragraphs of type in newspapers, they force justify everything because it requires less work to clean up the paragraphs later, and it's just faster because newspapers have deadlines to hit, right? But if you adjust the size of the text box, sometimes you can close up those rivers, but other times, like this, you make them worse. So I generally don't recommend using the force justifications unless it really makes a lot of sense, right? Now, other things you can do is indent by simply indenting your entire paragraph using the indent feature here, right, which moves everything inwards, gives you a little bit of a barrier on the left side, like that. And you can also do a right indent if we had more text, which we don't really have here. But if you had more text, you can shove it all over to the right, which works as well. You can indent just the first line of type, right? A certain amount of points. And this works just like hitting the tab key in Microsoft Word or Google Docs, gives you a little bit of an indent on the top there. So these come in handy as well. Now, there's not as many function changes, not as many features in the paragraph palette, but again, these are all super useful as well. And of course, the aforementioned, do you want to allow for hyphenation or not? You can just check or uncheck this, which comes in handy a lot. Okay, so those are the basic two functions of the type tool. Line by line type or paragraph-based type inside of a text box. Now, the only other thing I want to show you right now before I let you go to play around with these tools is how you can treat these in terms of color. So once you've gone ahead and made your typographic adjustments, type is now treated pretty much like a shape in terms of color. So you choose the type that you want to work with using your black selection arrow. And of course, then you go over here to your color picker, or you can use the color pull down here. And when you choose a color, it automatically changes the color of the type accordingly. Now that's pretty straightforward. The other thing that is helpful is that if you grab your type tool and just highlight a certain character or set of words or whatever, you can change the color specifically just for that. So I can change that from a red to an orange. I can change my jumbo question mark here over to something like green. So anyway, you get the idea. You can get specific about how you color your type, so you can really sort of drill down. And that technique works either with line by line type or by paragraph type. Now, I did mention about putting strokes around your type, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I'll give you an example of how it doesn't work and it does work. If we are trying to put a line around, say, this type, so let's say we decide that we're going to put a blue line around all the type, you can see that it kind of makes it, it squishes the shape of the type. So let's zoom in here so you can get a good look at it, and we'll see what happens. So you can see it adds a stroke around it, but it changes the sort of anatomy of the type by really kind of squishing it with the letter form. So it's not necessarily a great idea to put a stroke around a piece of type. Okay, so that's all I'm going to show you right now for typography. I want you to break out Illustrator and grab yourself the type tools, play around with the functionality, see what you can come up with, and we are going to introduce some typographic concepts a little later in the week so you'll better understand sort of where typography comes from, how it functions, what its major purpose in design is, and then how you can employ some of those tools that I just showed you in a way that's more communicative. I'm also going to show you some more of the sort of fancier, more special effect-y type tools later on in the week, including the area type tool, type on a path, and the envelope tool, which is all super fun. All right, so I will see you guys soon. Go mess around with some type. Have some fun. Bye-bye.